She was still holding the tray when Eleanor Hawthorne's voice cut across the room like a whip. "Remove yourself from this floor immediately. Kitchen help does not mingle with guests." Every head turned. Every landed on Margaret Ellis, her faded apron, her hands gone white around the tray's edge. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody said a word. And Margaret did what she had always done. She lowered her eyes. She made herself small. She began to turn away. Then she heard boots on the hardwood floor, slow, deliberate, and moving directly toward her. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next in Red Hollow, Montana, is going to change everything you think you know about who deserves to be chosen. The harvest dance came every year to Red Hollow. Like a promise, the town made to itself a promise that everything fine, that the good people had prospered, that the right families still held the right names, and that the natural order of things remained exactly as God and Montana intended it to be. Margaret Ellis had attended 9 of them, not as a guest. Never as a guest. She attended as the woman who kept the coffee hot and the trays moving and the kitchen from falling apart while every other soul in Red Hollow dressed in their finest and danced until their feet ached. That was the arrangement. That had always been the arrangement. And Margaret had long since made her peace with it, or something close enough to peace that she had stopped examining the difference. She was 26 years old, and she had spent the last 4 of those years working in the kitchen of the Hollow Creek Hotel, which sat the center of town and served as the social heart of every gathering Red Hollow organized for itself. Weddings, funerals, town council meetings, holiday suppers if it mattered to Red Hollow, it happened inside those walls. If it happened inside those walls, Margaret was somewhere in the background of it, making sure it ran. She was a large woman. Not simply tall or broad-shouldered the way some working women were. She carried real weight, a full and rounded body that no amount of hard labor had ever stripped from her frame. Her face was wide and soft, with dark eyes that noticed everything, and a mouth that stayed quiet about most of what it noticed. Her hands were the hands of someone who had worked since childhood, rough at the knuckles, strong across the palm, capable of things most women her age had never been asked to do. She was not beautiful by the standards Red Hollow used to measure such things. She had understood that fact about herself by the time she was 14. She had stopped grieving it sometime around 22. The night of the 9th harvest dance, Margaret was stationed near the far kitchen door, working a circuit between the preparation area and the main floor. Carrying trays of coffee and moving through the crowd the way water moves around stones quietly, efficiently, taking up as little space as possible while doing exactly what needed doing. The main hall of the Hollow Creek Hotel had been transformed for the occasion. Lantern light fell warm and golden across the polished floors. A 4-piece band occupied the corner near the fireplace, and they played the kind of music that made even serious men want to move their feet. The women of Red Hollow had dressed for competition silk ribbons, pressed cotton, hair arranged with precision that must have cost hours. They laughed in clusters near the windows and watched the door with the specific alertness of people waiting for someone important. They were waiting for Caleb Whitmore. Everyone was always waiting for Caleb Whitmore. Margaret had refilled the coffee service twice before he arrived, and she heard the shift in the room before she saw what caused it, the particular change in the quality that happens when the person everyone has been expecting finally walks through the door. She glanced up from her tray. He was tall. That was the first thing about him that registered, not his clothes, not his face, but the simple physical fact of his height, the way he occupied space without appearing to demand it. He was 34 years old, lean and broad through the shoulders, in the way that came from actual work rather than performance of it, with dark hair worn longer than fashion strictly required, and a face that had been weathered by Montana sun into something that stopped a few degrees short of what most women would have called handsome and landed squarely in something more interesting than that. He did not smile when he entered. He looked around the room with the flat, measuring expression of a man who had been to this particular party many times and expected it to go exactly as it always went. He was right about that. Within 4 minutes of his arrival, 3 mothers had positioned their daughters within conversational range. Within 8, the cluster around him had thickened to the point where Margaret could no longer see him from her circuit near the kitchen door. She did not try harder to see him. She refilled the tray and kept moving. It was during her third pass through the main floor that she first became aware of Eleanor Hawthorne. Eleanor Hawthorne was 51 years old and had occupied the position of Red Hollow's social authority for so long that most people had simply stopped remembering a time before her. Her husband, Arthur Hawthorne, owned the largest dry goods operation in the territory and sat on the town council, which meant Eleanor's opinion on any matter of social standing carried the weight of near-official pronouncement. She dressed expensively, moved deliberately, and had the particular gift of making every word she spoke sound like a conclusion rather than an opinion. She was standing near the punch table when Margaret passed, and Margaret had almost cleared her when Eleanor's voice landed. "You've been circling this room for the better part of an hour," Eleanor said. Not loudly. She never needed to be loud. "You're making the guests uncomfortable." Margaret stopped. She turned carefully with the tray level in her hands. "I apologize, Mrs. Hawthorne. I was just keeping the coffee fresh." "The coffee can wait." Eleanor's eyes moved over Margaret with the efficiency of someone taking inventory. "You should return to the kitchen. You're not a brief pause, the kind that carried more meaning than the words around it needed out here at the moment." Margaret understood exactly what was being said and what was not being said. She nodded. She turned toward the kitchen. She was 3 steps away when her path crossed, with a set of broad shoulders moving in the opposite direction, and the sudden contact sent the tray tilting. Margaret grabbed for it. The cups rattled. And 2 of them would have gone over the edge entirely if a pair of large, quick hands hadn't appeared from somewhere to her left and steadied the whole thing before disaster could fully announce itself. "Careful," said a low voice. "That's a long way for hot coffee to fall." Margaret looked up. Caleb Whitmore was standing 6 inches away from her, both hands still braced against the underside of the tray, his dark eyes level with hers. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, because it was what she always said when something happened that was not entirely her fault. His expression changed slightly. "Why are you apologizing? I was the one walking blind through a working woman's path. I should have been watching where I was going, so should I." He released the tray carefully, making sure she had it before he let go. "Are you all right?" Nobody had asked her that in a long time. Not in that particular tone, with that particular attentiveness, as though her answer genuinely mattered to whatever came next. Margaret blinked. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Whitmore," he said. "Caleb Whitmore and Margaret. Margaret Ellis. I work in the kitchen here. I know the hotel," Caleb said. "I didn't know they had someone this capable running their service floor." Margaret did not know what to do with a compliment delivered in a tone that sounded like it meant something, so she defaulted to what she knew. "I should get back, sir, before the coffee goes cold." "Before you go," Caleb said, and something in his voice made her stop. "What you just handled there, keeping that whole tray level with one hand, while the other went for the cups, that takes real presence of mind." "It takes practice," Margaret said. "Most things worth doing do." She looked at him for a moment. There was nothing performative in his expression. No trace of the display that men like him, wealthy men who knew they were being watched, tended to put on when they chose to notice someone beneath their station. He was simply looking at her the way a person looks at another person they have found genuinely interesting. It was disorienting. "Excuse me." The voice came from directly behind Margaret, and she recognized it before she turned that particular pitch of deliberate authority, the tone Eleanor Hawthorne used when she was making a correction in public. "Mr. Whitmore." Eleanor stepped forward, positioning herself between Caleb and Margaret with the smooth efficiency of long practice. "I believe you haven't yet been introduced to the Caldwell daughters. Their father is expanding operations into the northern range. I thought you might find the conversation worthwhile." Caleb's gaze moved from Eleanor to Margaret. In that fraction of a second, Margaret saw something in his expression that she could not quite name, a recognition maybe, or a decision being made. Then Eleanor's hand was on his arm and he was being guided away, and the moment closed behind him like water. Margaret stood at the edge of the main floor with her tray and her coffee, and the fading warmth of the unexpected 2 minutes of her 9th harvest dance. Then she went back to the kitchen. She was washing cups at the basin when Clara, the younger of the 2 kitchen girls, appeared at her elbow, with the expression of someone carrying news they cannot decide whether to deliver. "Eleanor Hawthorne," Clara said, keeping her voice low, told Mrs. Plum that you were pressing yourself on Mr. Whitmore. Margaret's hands went still in the water. "She said that?" "She said you were maneuvering, that it was embarrassing." Clara hesitated. Mrs. Plum didn't argue with her. Margaret looked down at the cup in her hands. She thought about the coffee tray tilting. She thought about quick hands appearing from the left. She thought about a voice asking whether she was all right. "I wasn't maneuvering," Margaret said. "I know that," Clara said. "It doesn't matter," Margaret said. "Eleanor Hawthorne thinks what she's going to think. That's not new." There it was again. That question, twice in one evening, and the second time from a girl young enough to be her little sister, and Margaret felt something move in her chest that she could not afford to examine too closely. "I'm fine," she said. "Get back to the bread service." She kept washing cups until the water went cold. The band played 3 more songs before the crowd began to thin. Margaret completed her circuits, cleared the tables, and kept her eyes on the trays in her hands and the floor beneath her feet and the space just ahead of wherever she was going. She did not look for Caleb Whitmore. She had no reason to look for Caleb Whitmore. What had happened between them was a near accident and 2 minutes of unexpected courtesy. And she was not a fool, and she knew exactly what kind of story she was allowed to be a part of, and what kind she was not. She knew. She had always known. She was near the side hall, moving a stack of empty serving plates back toward the kitchen, when she heard Eleanor Hawthorne's voice again, sharper now, carrying the distinctive edge of someone who had decided that a point needed to be made in front of an audience. "There she is." Margaret stopped. She did not turn immediately. She stood with the plates in her hands and counted 2 slow breaths and then turned, because there was no useful alternative. Eleanor was standing at the entrance to the side hall, with 4 other women arranged around her, the Caldwell sisters, Martha Vane, and a woman Margaret didn't recognize, but who wore the expression of someone ready to enjoy whatever was about to happen. Behind them, at a distance that suggested he had arrived separately and was not entirely certain what he had walked into, stood Caleb Whitmore. "I want to be certain there's no confusion," Eleanor said, speaking to Margaret with the precise, even tone of a woman correcting a child in public. "About this evening. About what is and is not appropriate conduct for the hotel staff." Margaret kept her hand steady on the plates. "I understand my position, Mrs. Hawthorne. I wonder if you do." Eleanor took a single step forward. "Because from where I was standing earlier tonight, you appeared to be inserting yourself into a conversation that was not yours to enter." "I nearly dropped a tray," Margaret said. "Mr. Whitmore prevented it." "That was the entirety of what happened." "The entirety," Eleanor repeated, with a small smile that meant she had decided to find something amusing. "How precise?" She glanced back at her companions. "Do you see what I mean? This is what happens when people don't understand where they belong. They begin inventing their own version of events." The woman Margaret didn't recognize laughed. Martha Vane at least had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. The Caldwell sisters watched with the blank pleasantness of people who had learned it was safer to follow Eleanor's lead than to think for themselves. Margaret stood with her plates and her 2 measured breaths and the particular stillness that 9 years of service work had built into her spine, the ability to take whatever was being given without showing on the outside what it cost on the inside. "You're a large woman," Eleanor said, and the shift in direction was so sudden that it landed like a slap. "I don't say that to be unkind. I say it because I think someone ought to have said it to you plainly before now." Her voice stayed level, almost gentle, which made it worse. A woman of your build pursuing the attention of a man like Caleb Whitmore is not merely inappropriate. It is embarrassing. For you, for the hotel, for anyone who has to witness it. The hall went very quiet. Somewhere in the main room, the band played on, indifferent. Margaret looked at Eleanor Hawthorne for a long moment. She thought about 9 years. She thought about how long she had practiced making herself small. She thought about what it felt like when a pair of hands came out of nowhere to keep the coffee from falling. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Hawthorne," she said. Her voice was level. Her hands on the plates were steady. "I'll return to the kitchen now." She turned, she walked. She did not run, because she was Margaret Ellis, and she was 26 years old, and she had decided a long time ago that Eleanor Hawthorne would never see her run. Behind her, she heard a man's voice low and carrying a temperature she hadn't heard in it before. "That was unnecessary, Eleanor." She did not stop walking. But she heard it. She carried it all the way to the kitchen and set the plates down on the work table and stood with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the middle distance while Clara pretended very carefully not to notice anything was wrong. After a while, Margaret began washing the plates. She washed them thoroughly. She stacked them in their proper place. She untied her apron, folded it over the back of the stool, and pulled her coat from the hook by the service door. "You're going early," Clara said. "My work is done," Margaret said. "Margaret." Clara's voice had something careful in it. "He said something to her after you left." Margaret buttoned the top button of her coat. "I heard. You don't want to know what he said?" "It doesn't change anything," Margaret said. She pushed open the service door and stepped out into the October night, where the air was cold and clean and smelled like pine and distant wood smoke, and had absolutely nothing to say about social position or appropriate conduct, or the specific weight of a plus-size woman who had nearly dropped a coffee tray in front of the richest man in Red Hollow, Montana. She walked home. She was halfway down the back lane when she realized her hands were still shaking. Not from cold, not from fear. From something older and more complicated than either of those things, the particular trembling that happens in a person's body when they have been seen, in the space of a single evening, in two completely opposite ways, once as nothing and once as something. She pressed her hands together to stop the shaking. She kept walking. The stars over Red Hollow were extraordinary that night, the way they always were this far from anywhere. Enormous and indifferent and burning with a cold fire that didn't care who you were, or what the Hawthorne women thought of your figure, or whether the richest cowboy in Montana had said something sharp on your behalf in a side hallway of the Hollow Creek Hotel. Margaret looked up at them for a long moment. Then she went inside and made herself a cup of tea and sat at her small table in her small room and thought about nothing in particular until sleep came for her. She dreamed about coffee trays and quick hands, and a voice asking whether she was all right. In the dream, she answered honestly. When she woke before dawn to start her shift, she remembered the question but not the answer she had given, and she decided that was probably for the best. She tied her apron. She started the stove. She began another day in the kitchen of the Hollow Creek Hotel, where the coffee needed to be hot, and the trays needed to move, and someone needed to keep everything running, while Red Hollow went about the serious business of deciding who mattered and who did not. Margaret Ellis knew which category she occupied. She had always known. But somewhere between the dream and the waking, something had shifted, some small, stubborn, previously dormant thing, and, as she stood at the stove with the heat rising around her hands, she had the distinct and inconvenient feeling that knowing a thing and accepting it were not quite as identical as she had spent 9 years pretending they were. She pushed the thought down. She focused on the coffee. She told herself it would pass. It did not pass. Caleb Whitmore came back the next morning. Margaret heard him before she saw him, not his voice, but the reaction to his presence, the particular hush that moved through the hotel's ground floor like a wave when someone unexpected walked in somewhere they didn't belong. She was at the work table, with her back to the kitchen door, her hands deep in bread dough, and she heard Clara make a small sound behind her that meant something was happening. She turned. Caleb Whitmore was standing in the kitchen doorway. Not the front entrance, not the dining room. The kitchen doorway, the service entrance that connected the back corridor to the working part of the hotel, the door that guests didn't use, because guests didn't come back here, because back here was for people like Margaret. And men like Caleb Whitmore did not stand in doorways like this one. He was holding his hat in both hands. "Miss Ellis," he said. Margaret looked at him for 3 full seconds before she remembered to answer. "Mr. Whitmore." Her hands were still in the dough. She pulled them out slowly. "This is the kitchen." "I can see that. Guests don't generally come back here." "I'm aware." He looked around, not the way someone looks when they're judging an unfamiliar space, but the way someone looks when they're taking something seriously. "I wanted to speak with you. I knocked at the front and Mrs. Plum told me you were working. I asked if I could come through." A brief pause. "She didn't say no." "Mrs. Plum never says no to you," Margaret said. "You own 3 of the accounts that keep this hotel operating through winter." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, closer to recognition. "That's a very precise thing to know," he said. "I pay attention," Margaret said. "It's part of the work." Clara had gone entirely motionless near the bread shelf, doing an exceptional impression of someone who wasn't listening to every single word. Margaret looked at Caleb. "What did you want to speak with me about?" He took a single step into the kitchen, just one enough to clear the doorway but not enough to crowd her. "Last night," he said. "What Eleanor said to you. I want you to know that I told her it was uncalled for." "I heard you say something," Margaret said. "From the hallway." "Then you heard me tell her she was wrong. I heard you tell her it was unnecessary." Margaret reached for the cloth to wipe her hands. "That's not quite the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "It's not." That landed differently than she expected. Most men, when corrected on a distinction they'd rather not examine, found a way to redirect the conversation. Caleb simply stood with the correction and absorbed it, the way someone absorbs a truth they've already half acknowledged to themselves. "I should have said she was wrong," he said. "Because she was." Margaret set down the cloth. "Mr. Whitmore, you don't owe me anything." "What happened last night?" "What happened last night," he said quietly, but without any softness that could be mistaken for apology, "was that a woman did her job well and got humiliated in front of a hallway full of people for it. And I stood there longer than I should have before I said anything." He looked at her directly. "I don't like that about myself. I'm trying to do better." Margaret looked at him. She had spent 9 years learning to read the difference between men who said things and men who meant them. It was a skill she developed, the way she developed most of her skills, through necessity, through the accumulated evidence of what happened when you got it wrong. Caleb Whitmore, standing in her kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and no audience to perform for, looked like a man who meant what he said. That was its own kind of danger. "I appreciate that," Margaret said carefully. "But you've said it now." So he agreed. He turned his hat once in his hands. "I also came because I wanted to finish the conversation we started before Eleanor interrupted it." Margaret blinked. "We weren't having a conversation." "You were keeping my tray from falling. And then we were talking," Caleb said. "About practice. About things worth doing." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "I found it interesting." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere on the other side of the wall, the dining room was filling with the early breakfast crowd. Margaret could hear the scrape of chairs and the distant clink of tableware, the ordinary machinery of the hotel's morning. "Clara," Margaret said, without taking her eyes off Caleb. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said, already moving. "The rolls need to go out." "Yes, ma'am." Clara gathered the bread rolls with the brisk efficiency of someone who had correctly identified that she was being given an exit, and she was through the kitchen door and gone in under 30 seconds. Margaret turned back to Caleb. "What do you want to talk about?" she said. He pulled out the stool on his side of the work table and sat down, setting his hat on his knee. "What do you know about the northern grazing leases?" he said. She stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" "The Territorial Council is meeting next month to renegotiate the grazing leases on the North Range." I've been trying to work out what the fair rate ought to be, and I keep arriving at numbers that feel off. My foreman thinks I'm calculating the carrying capacity wrong. He looked at her with that same level, assessing expression from the night before. You mentioned you pay attention. I've heard from 3 different men that the kitchen of this hotel is where the real business conversations happen. That the people who serve the tables hear everything. He paused. I'm asking what you've heard. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Why would you ask me that? Because I need accurate information, and I suspect you have it. You could ask any man in the dining room. I could, Caleb said. And they'd tell me what they wanted me to know. You don't want anything from me. He held her gaze. That makes your information more reliable. It was so plainly, practically true that Margaret didn't have a good argument against it. She thought about the conversations she had heard over 4 years of breakfast and lunch and dinner service. The land deals discussed over coffee she had poured. The grazing arguments that played out over plates she had cleared. The numbers men quoted to each other while she moved through the dining room like furniture. She had never intended to retain any of it. She had simply been unable not to. The Caldwell operation is running 40 head more than their lease technically allows, she said. They've been managing it by rotating stock across the Miller property when the council inspector comes through, but Miller's been making noise about selling east, and if that goes through, Caldwell loses his buffer. She paused. If you're calculating against what the leases say rather than what's actually running, your numbers will always be low. Caleb was very still. How do you know that? He said. Edward Caldwell had breakfast here every Tuesday for 2 years, Margaret said. He talks when he eats, a beat. Then Caleb laughed. It was a genuine laugh, short and real, the kind that happens before a person can decide whether to let it out. Lord, he said. I've been paying consultants in Billings for information half as useful as what you just gave me in 40 seconds. Then you're paying too much, Margaret said. He looked at her with something in his face that she was not yet equipped to name. What else do you know? He said. And that was how it began. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Not always for long, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes just long enough to ask one question and hear one answer. But he came back. Every morning for the first week, and then every morning of the second week, and by the time the third week arrived, Margaret had stopped being startled by the sound of his boots in the back corridor and had started simply setting out 2 cups when she made the first pot of coffee. She told herself it was professional courtesy. She told herself a lot of things that third week. The conversations shifted, the way conversations do. When 2 people spend enough time together, they moved from business to something less easily categorized. He told her about the ranch, about the specific and relentless work of managing land on the scale his family had built, about the loneliness of making decisions that affected 40 men's livelihoods and having no one in his life who could sit across a table and simply think through the problem with him. Your father, Margaret said one morning. He's still at the ranch? He's there, Caleb said. He's not. He stopped. He's not well. Hasn't been for a while. He's present, but there's a distance in him now that wasn't there before my mother passed. He turned his coffee cup in both hands. I run the operation. He sits on the porch and watches the cattle move. Does he know you come here? He knows I go into town. A pause. He hasn't asked why more often than usual. Margaret absorbed this. You're lonely, she said. It wasn't a question, and she hadn't meant it as a kind thing, simply as the accurate identification of a condition she'd observed. Caleb looked at her, simply, without deflection. So am I, Margaret said. They sat with that for a moment, 2 people on opposite sides of a kitchen table who had just, without drama or performance, told each other something true. Then Caleb said, How long have you been in Red Hollow? 9 years. Where before that? Kansas. My mother's sister took me in after my parents died. She was a housekeeper. She taught me everything I know about this work. Margaret paused. She passed 4 years ago. I've been on my own since. You have no one here? I have Clara, Margaret said. She's 20 and she means well. That's not quite the same as having someone. No, Margaret agreed, it isn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The way Eleanor spoke to you at the dance. Is that how it's been in this town? For a long time?" Margaret looked at him. She considered several different answers. "People like Eleanor Hawthorne," she said finally, "don't actually think about women like me very often. We cross their minds when we're inconvenient or when we need to be reminded of something. The rest of the time, she searched for the word scenery." "That doesn't answer my question." "Yes," she said. "It has been. For a long time." Something moved through his expression that she could not quite read, something complicated and with an edge to it. "Does it?" he started. "Don't ask me if it hurts," Margaret said. "That's not a useful question." He closed his mouth. "What's the useful question?" he said. She thought about it. "Ask me what I've done with it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "What have you done with it?" "Learn to listen," she said. "Learn to watch. Learn to keep my own counsel and do my work and pay attention to the things that matter and let the rest go by." She met his eyes. "I know more about how this territory actually operates than most of the men who think they run it. I know it because nobody thought to stop talking when I walked through the room, a beat. Eleanor Hawthorne has never once in 9 years considered that her greatest mistake might be that she taught me to be invisible." Caleb sat very still. "You're remarkable." "I'm practical," Margaret said. "Both," he said. "Both can be true." Margaret stood up from the work table and went to refill the coffee, because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the way he had said that without flourish, without the careful performance of a man trying to make an impression, had done something to the air in the kitchen that she was not prepared to acknowledge. She came back with the pot and refilled his cup without looking at him. "You should go," she said, "before Mrs. Plum starts talking." "Mrs. Plum is already talking," Caleb said. "Then there's no reason to give her more material." He stood. He picked up his hat. He looked at her across the work table for a moment with an expression she had begun to catalogue privately, the one that meant he was thinking something he hadn't decided yet whether to say. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll be here," Margaret said. "I'm always here." He left. Margaret stood at the work table with the coffee pot in her hand and the warmth from the stove pressing against her back and the full weight of what was happening settling into her chest. It's like something she couldn't quite name. Not yet, but she was starting to. The town noticed before she'd given it permission. That was the problem with small places they ran on observation. Every person was always watching every other person with the dedicated attention of someone who had very little else to distract them. And Caleb Whitmore making daily trips to the back kitchen of the Hollow Creek Hotel was not the kind of thing that passed unremarked. By the end of the second week, she heard it from Clara first. "People are saying things," Clara said, in the careful tone of someone delivering information they know will not be well received. Margaret didn't look up from the pot she was scrubbing. "What kind of things that you've been?" Clara stopped. "That you're pursuing him, that you've found a way to get him alone in the kitchen, and you've been," someone used the word entrapping. Margaret's hands went still in the water. "Entrapping," she repeated. "I know," Clara said. "I know it's not who said it." Clara hesitated. "I heard it from Jenny at the Mercantile," she said. But she heard it from Martha Vane, and Martha Vane was at the Hawthorne house for tea on Thursday. Eleanor. Of course. Margaret went back to scrubbing the pot. "It doesn't matter," she said. "Margaret, it doesn't matter, Clara. People are going to say what they say. I can't stop them." "You could ask him to stop coming." The words landed in the kitchen and sat there. Margaret scrubbed the pot. She thought about the mornings. The coffee going cold while they talked past the point where she should have sent him away. The way he listened, not the way men listened when they were waiting for their turn to talk, but the way someone listened when they actually wanted to understand what was being said. The specific quality of those 2 cups on the work table, the ease that had built itself without either of them trying to build it. She thought about how much she did not want to ask him to stop coming. That was the thing she hadn't let herself look at directly. She looked at it now briefly in the steam coming off the pot. Then she put it away. I won't ask him that, she said. Okay, she said. Just that. But it wasn't okay, and they both knew it, and the morning was different after that, not between her and Clara, but inside Margaret herself, where something had moved and was not going back to where it had been. He came the next morning and she did not set out 2 cups. She set out 1, and kept working when she heard his boots in the corridor, and when he appeared in the kitchen doorway she did not turn around. Margaret, he said. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. A pause. Mr. Whitmore, he repeated, and she could hear the shift hit in his voice. That's new. I've been thinking, she said, still not turning. About the nature of these visits. What about them? They've become a topic of conversation in town. She kept her hands moving, kept her eyes on the work. I understand that's not your intention. I'm not suggesting it is. But the effect is the same regardless of the intention, and the effect is that people are saying things about me that are making my position here more difficult. Silence, then his boots moved, not toward the door. Toward at me, he said. She turned. He was standing 3 feet away with the expression she had come to recognize as the one that meant he had already thought this through and arrived at a position he wasn't going to retreat from easily. Who's been talking to you, he said. It doesn't matter who. It matters to me. That's the problem, Margaret said. It matters to you. And what matters to you matters in this town, and what matters in this town eventually comes back to the kitchen of the hotel and lands on me. She held his gaze. You have a ranch to run. You have a reputation that doesn't depend on morning visits to a hotel kitchen. I have this job and this room and nothing else, and I cannot afford to lose either one, because the Hawthorne women decided I needed to be reminded of my place. Something shifted in his face, something that went quiet and then went hard. They threatened your position here, he said. Not directly. But Mrs. Plum had a conversation with me yesterday, Margaret said. About the importance of professional boundaries. About how the hotel's reputation is something she takes seriously. She paused. She was very polite about it. The expression on Caleb's face was the expression of a man deciding something. Margaret, please don't, she said. Please don't make this about what you can do for me. That's not, she stopped, took a breath. That's not what this has been. And I don't want it to become that. He was quiet for a long moment. What has it been, he said, quietly, like the question mattered. Margaret looked at him. She thought about the honest answer. She thought about all the reasons the honest answer was door she couldn't afford to open. Something that was good, she said, and that I think probably has to stop. The kitchen held them both for a long, still moment. Then Caleb said, what if I don't want it to stop? What you want, Margaret said, as gently and as firmly as she could manage, isn't the thing that bears the cost when it goes wrong. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, and she saw in the second after he absorbed it that he understood exactly what she meant, and that understanding it made it worse for him, not better, which was not what she had expected, and which did something to her that she was absolutely not going to look at right now. All right, he said. He picked up his hat. He looked at her for one more moment. For what it's worth, he said, the cost you're describing, the risk, the reputation, the position you could lose, you shouldn't have to carry any of that alone. I know, Margaret said, but you do because of how things are. Yes, he put his hat on. He walked to the kitchen door. He stopped with one hand on the frame and stood there with his back to her for just long enough that she had time to understand he was considering something. Then he said, without turning, I'll respect what you're asking. I won't come back uninvited. Margaret stood at the work table. She stood there for a full minute, not moving, not reaching for anything, just standing with the particular stillness of someone who has just done a hard, correct thing and is waiting to feel better about it. She didn't feel better about it. She went back to work. The days that followed were quiet in the way that only felt like quiet from the outside. Inside Margaret, they were not quiet at all. They were loud with the specific noise of a woman arguing with herself, rehearsing conversations that hadn't happened, cataloging reasons and counter-reasons with the relentless efficiency of a mind that had nowhere else to put its energy. She worked. She kept the kitchen running. She made the coffee and moved her paid attention to the conversations happening around her with the same practiced invisibility she had refined over 9 years, and she did not look up every time she heard boots in the back corridor. She only did that for the first few days. By the end of the first week without him, she had mostly stopped. Almost. It was 11 days after she had asked him not to come back that she was crossing the main street in the early afternoon, returning from the dry goods store with supplies for the weekend service, when she heard her name in a voice she had come to know better than she'd intended. She turned. Caleb was on the other side of the street, near the hardware store, with his foreman beside him and a list in his hand. He had not, from his posture, been looking for her. He had simply looked up at the right moment and seen her, the way two people in a small town inevitably see each other when there are only 3 streets and one of each of them. He tipped his hat. It was a simple gesture, the ordinary courtesy of a Western man acknowledging a woman he knew on a public street, nothing that anyone watching would have found remarkable. Margaret felt it in her sternum. She nodded. She kept walking. Behind her, she heard his foreman say something in a low voice, and she heard Caleb's reply too quiet for her to make out the words. But the tone of it was the tone of a man ending a conversation he doesn't want to have. She turned the corner. She stood against the side of the mercantile building for a moment, with the supply parcel in her arms, and the October air cold and direct against her face, and the absolute, inconvenient, undeniable knowledge sitting in her chest that she had done the right thing for the right reasons, and it had not made it stop being the wrong thing for every other reason. She pushed off the wall. She went back to work. 2 days later, Clara found her in the kitchen after the breakfast service was cleared, and stood in the way Clara stood when she was bracing herself to say something difficult. "What?" Margaret said. "There's going to be a town meeting Thursday evening," Clara said. "About the northern grazing leases." Margaret looked up. "What about them?" "The council is trying to push through a new rate structure that most of the smaller ranchers can't afford." Clara hesitated. "There's talk that the Hawthorne family has a private arrangement with the council chairman, that the new rates would consolidate the northern range toward the bigger operations." Margaret was very still. "Where did you hear that?" "From Sam at the livery. His brother-in-law runs a small spread on the north edge." Clara met her eyes. "He said the small ranchers don't know how to fight it. They don't have the information. They don't know what the actual numbers mean." Margaret thought about Caleb's voice across the kitchen work table. The questions about carrying capacity, about fair rates, about the numbers that didn't add up. She thought about everything she had heard over 4 years of invisible service in this dining room. She thought about what Eleanor Hawthorne had never considered when she decided Margaret Ellis was furniture. "What time Thursday?" Clara blinked. "At the town hall." Margaret untied her apron. "I need," she said slowly, "to write some things down." She wrote for 3 hours that night. Not a letter. Not a petition. Something more precise than either of those, a document of numbers, organized the way she had organized everything she'd absorbed over 4 years of serving coffee to men who talked freely in front of women they considered invisible. Carrying capacities, lease rates, the gap between what the council's proposed structure claimed to be based on and what the actual grazing numbers in the territory showed. The Caldwell arrangement with the Miller property. 3 other situations she had overheard in pieces and assembled silently over time, the way you assemble a puzzle when no one knows you're looking at the pieces. She wrote until her hand cramped, then switched hands and kept going. Clara knocked at 11 to tell her the lamps in the main hall needed turning down. Margaret told her to go to bed. Clara looked at the papers spread across the kitchen work table and left without arguing. By midnight, Margaret had 7 pages. She read them back. She corrected 2 figures she wasn't certain of and marked them clearly as estimates. She organized the whole thing into a sequence that moved from the broadest facts to the specific numbers that proved what those facts meant in practice. Then she sat back and looked at what she had made, and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that quite pride. She had learned to be careful with pride, but was adjacent to it. Something quieter. The satisfaction of a person who has done careful work and knows it. Then she thought about Thursday. Then she thought about what would happen when she walked into that town hall meeting and what every person in that room would see when she did. She folded the papers. She put them in the inside pocket of her coat, which she hung on the hook by the service door. She went to bed. She did not sleep particularly well. Thursday arrived with the particular determination of days that have been decided in advance. Margaret completed her morning work, her midday work, her afternoon preparations for the next day's service, and at 6:30 she untied her apron for the second time that week and told Clara she would be back by 9. Clara looked at her coat, at the slight bulk of the folded papers in the inside pocket. "Do you want me to come?" "No," Margaret said. "Stay and lock up the kitchen." "Margaret, I'll be fine," Margaret said. "I've been invisible in this town for 9 years. One more room full of people who won't expect me to speak isn't going to break me." She buttoned her coat. She walked to the town hall. The meeting had already drawn a crowd by the time she arrived: ranchers and their wives, merchants, a cluster of men from the northern range, who had the specific look of people who had come prepared to be disappointed. The council members sat at a long table at the front. Chairman Gerald Oakes occupied the center, a man of 60 with the build of someone who had once done physical work and now preferred to direct others who did it. Arthur Hawthorne sat 2 seats to his right. Margaret found a place near the back wall. She stood. She was not the only person standing. The hall was full enough that chairs were a limited resource. But she was aware, in the way she was always aware, of the glances that tracked her arrival and then moved away, puzzled by her presence in a way that hadn't yet decided whether it mattered. Oakes called the meeting to order. The proposal was presented in the flat, jargon-heavy language of official processing, designed to be difficult to argue with a restructured lease rate schedule, framed as a modernization, grounded in what Oakes called updated assessments of territorial carrying capacity. The numbers he cited were wrong, not slightly wrong. Structurally wrong, in a way that would make sense only if the data feeding them had been drawn from official records that didn't reflect what was actually running on the land. Margaret knew this because she had spent 3 hours the previous night calculating exactly how wrong they were. A rancher from the North Range, she recognized him as Sam's brother-in-law, a lean and weathered man named Hicks, stood up 15 minutes in. "Those capacity numbers don't match what I've seen on my own acreage," Hicks said. "I don't know where you're drawing from, Chairman, but they're not matching what the land is actually running." Oakes leaned back with the practiced patience of a man who had dismissed objections before and expected to dismiss this one without difficulty. "The figures are drawn from the Territorial Survey Office records," he said. "They represent the most current available data." "Then the survey office is wrong," Hicks said. "I understand you might find new rates uncomfortable, Mr. Hicks, it's not about uncomfortable." Hicks's voice was getting heat in it. "These rates will put me under. They'll put half the men in this room under." "That's not a discomfort, Chairman. That's a catastrophe." A murmur moved through the room. Oakes let it run its course and then raised one hand. "The council has thoroughly reviewed the implications." "No." The word came from the back of the room, from Margaret. She had not planned the exact moment. She had simply felt the conversation reaching the point where it would slide irreversibly toward conclusion without the information it needed, and her body had made the decision before her mind had finished weighing it. The room turned, every head, all at once. Margaret stood at the back wall with her coat buttoned and her hands at her sides and the folded papers in her inside pocket and the weight of every eye in Red Hollow on her. She recognized Eleanor Hawthorne in the third row, turned around with an expression that moved through surprise into something sharper and harder in the space of 2 seconds. Margaret looked at Oakes. "The survey office records are outdated by at least 3 years," she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. "And they don't account for the actual stock being run on the Northern Range leases, which has been consistently above the recorded figures for at least 2 of those years." Oakes stared at her. "I'm sorry," said with a precision that made clear he was not sorry at all. "And you are?" "Margaret Ellis. I work at the Hollow Creek Hotel." The silence that followed had a texture to it, the specific quality of a room full of people recalibrating. Miss Ellis, Oakes said carefully, "This is a formal council proceeding." "This is not. I have documentation," Margaret said. She reached into her inside pocket and took out the 7 pages. She walked to the front of the room. It was the longest walk she had ever taken in Red Hollow. Longer than any circuit she had ever run with a coffee tray. Longer than the walk from the side hallway to the kitchen on the night of the harvest dance, because this walk was in the wrong direction, not toward the edges, toward the back. Toward the service door, this walk went forward, down the center of the room, with every pair of eyes in the hall following her. She heard Eleanor Hawthorne say something in a low voice to the woman beside her. She kept walking. She reached the council table and placed the papers in front of Gerald Oakes. The figures on the first 3 pages establish the actual carrying capacity of the Northern Range based on stock movement records from the last 2 years, she said. The figures on pages 4 and 5 show the gap between those numbers and the survey office data your proposal is based on. Pages 6 and 7 show what the rate structure would actually look like if it were based on accurate numbers rather than outdated ones. Oakes looked at the papers. He looked at Margaret. He looked at the papers again. "Where did you get this information?" he said. "I pay attention," Margaret said. "It's part of my work." Someone in the room laughed, a short, startled sound, quickly suppressed. Arthur Hawthorne leaned forward from 2 seats down. "Chairman, this is highly irregular. We cannot base a council proceeding on documents produced by a hotel kitchen worker with no official standing." "The documents don't require my standing," Margaret said. "They require accuracy. You're welcome to verify every figure I've cited against the actual stock records. If my numbers are wrong, you'll know within a day." She held Hawthorne's gaze without flinching. "If they're right, then the question becomes why the proposal before this council is based on figures that don't match them." The room was very quiet. Then Hicks said, from his seat near the middle, "I'd like to see those pages." "So would I," said another voice. Then another. Oakes looked at the papers in front of him with the expression of a man who had planned his evening differently. Margaret stepped back from the table. She returned to her place at the back wall. She stood, she waited. The meeting went on for another 90 minutes. The pages passed from hand to hand. 3 men with their own records stood up and confirmed specific figures Margaret had cited. Oakes called 2 recesses. Arthur Hawthorne made 4 attempts to redirect the discussion, each of which was met with a growing impatience from the men on the Northern Range who had come to the hall prepared to be railroaded and had found, unexpectedly, that they had numbers on their side. The vote to table the proposal pending full review passed 8-3. It was not a victory. Margaret knew that. Tabled was not defeated, and the people driving the proposal had resource and patience that the small ranchers didn't. But it was time and time in her experience was often the only thing that stood between a bad decision and a worse one. She was pulling on her coat to leave when she heard boots crossing the hall floor toward her. She turned. Caleb Whitmore had been there the whole time. She had not let herself look for him when she walked in, and she had not let herself look for him during the meeting, and so she had not known until this moment that he had been somewhere in that room when she walked to the front, when she placed the papers on the table, when she stood at the back wall while the figures she had written by lamplight the previous night passed through the hands of men who needed them. He stopped 2 feet from her. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him, before something that went past the recognizable and into territory she didn't have a name for yet. "You came to the meeting," he said. "I had information that was relevant," Margaret said. "You walked to the front of that room," he said. "In front of everyone. The information wasn't useful at the back. Margaret." He said her name the way he sometimes said it, like it was the complete sentence, like everything else he might add was unnecessary. "You just changed the outcome of that vote. I provided accurate numbers," she said. "The men in that room made their own decisions. Stop doing that," he said. She looked at him. "Doing what?" "Minimizing what you just did." There was something in his voice that she wasn't sure she was equipped to hear. I have 3 attorneys in Billings who have been trying to find a lever against this proposal for 6 weeks. You found it in 3 hours with a pen and a kitchen lamp. He paused. Why didn't you tell me? When we were talking you had all of this. You knew. It wasn't my place, Margaret said. That is, he said quietly, the most wrong thing I have ever heard you say. She went still. You told me, he continued, that what you'd done with 9 years of being invisible was learn things. That Eleanor Hawthorne's greatest mistake was making you invisible. And then when the moment came to use what you'd learned, you walked into that hall alone, without telling me, without asking for help. I didn't need help, Margaret said. I know you didn't, he said. That's not the point. Then what is the point? He looked at her. The point, he said, is that you shouldn't have been alone when you walked to that table. The hall had emptied mostly around them. A few men were still talking near the door. Eleanor Hawthorne had gone, which Margaret registered with a specific kind of relief she herself was practical. You came to the meeting, Margaret said carefully. I didn't know you were there. I come to every council meeting, Caleb said. I've been coming since I was 22, and my father handed me the operation. I didn't see you. You weren't looking for me. She hadn't been. She'd made it a decision not to. She recognized, standing here with the empty hall around them and the night outside the windows, that decision had been its own kind of lie, not a dishonest lie, but a self-protective one. The kind that does the work of protection so efficiently that you don't notice what else it cost you. When you stopped coming to the kitchen, she said, I thought it was the right thing. For both of us. I respected what you asked, he said. I told you I would. You did. That's not the same as thinking you were right. He turned his hat in his hands, the same gesture from the kitchen doorway weeks ago, which now felt like something she had always known. Margaret, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually answer it, instead of deciding in advance what answer you're allowed to give. She waited. Do you want me to stop, he said. Not because of the town, not because of your position, not because of Eleanor Hawthorne. What you actually want. The hall was very quiet. She heard the wind outside. She heard the last of the ranchers pulling the main door shut behind them. She heard, somewhere distant, the sound of Red Hollow settling into its evening. She thought about the 2 cups on the work table. She thought about the mornings. She thought about the dream where she answered honestly. No, she said. I don't want you to stop. Something in his face changed. Not a smile, something deeper than a smile. Something that happened behind the expression rather than on top of it. He said, then I won't. He walked her back to the hotel. Not touching, they walked side by side on the main street of Red Hollow, 2 feet apart, in the perfectly ordinary way that a man and a woman who knew each other well might walk together on a cold October evening. But side by side, in public, on the main street, Margaret was aware of every window they passed. She was aware, and she kept walking, because she had walked to the front of a town hall full of people 2 hours ago with every eye in the territory on her, and she was not going to let a public street unsettle her. Caleb walked beside her without comment. At the hotel service entrance, he stopped. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she said. She went inside. She stood with her back against the closed door and her coat still buttoned, and the cold air from outside still caught in the fabric, and she breathed carefully for a moment. Clara appeared from the kitchen. She took one look at Margaret's face. How'd it go, she said. They tabled the vote, Margaret said. And? Clara said, because she was 20 years old but not unobservant. And Margaret said, I think things are changing. Clara smiled. Margaret went to hang up her coat. The next morning, Caleb was at the kitchen door at his usual time, which was not a usual time anymore but was being reclaimed, carefully, like a room that had been closed off and was now being reopened. Margaret had 2 cups on the work table. She did not make a point of it, and neither did he. They talked about the meeting. He told her what he'd heard from the Northern Range men afterward relief, but the guarded kind, the kind that understood the fight wasn't over. She told him what she'd been unable to fit on 7 pages. He listened with the full attention she had come to rely on without meaning to. After a while, the conversation moved the way it always did. My Father wants to meet you, Caleb said. Margaret went still. Why, she said, because I've told him about you. He paused. Apparently, I've been talking about you often enough that he asked who you were, and when I told him, he said I wanted to meet the woman who's been making me think this clearly. Margaret looked at her coffee cup. Your father, she said slowly, is Thomas Whitmore. He is. He's been running cattle in this territory for 40 years. 43, he's not going to. She stopped herself. What? Caleb said. He's not going to be pleased, she said. About the specifics of the situation. The what we are. She gestured slightly, meaning the 2 cups and the work table and the walk home the previous evening and all the rest of it. What it looks like from the outside. Caleb looked at her steadily. I told him the truth about what it looks like, he said. He still wants to meet you. Margaret absorbed this. What truth did you tell him, she said. Caleb put his cup down. That I haven't been this certain about anything in a very long time, he said. And that the last time I was this certain, I was standing in the kitchen doorway, with my hat in my hands, talking to a woman who told me not to apologize for getting in her way. The kitchen held them. Outside, Red Hollow was starting its day. Margaret could hear the town assembling itself, wagons on the main street, voices carrying from the direction of the mercantile. The ordinary sounds of a world that had its own opinions about what was happening in this kitchen and had not yet finished having them. She thought about Eleanor Hawthorne. She thought about the walk to the front of the town hall. She thought about Thomas Whitmore on his porch, watching the cattle move, a distance in him that hadn't been there before his wife died. She thought about what it meant when a man said he hadn't been this certain about anything in a very long time, and said it in the voice of someone reporting a fact rather than performing a feeling. When, she said. Sunday, Caleb said, if that works. I have Sunday afternoons off, Margaret said. I know, he said. I asked. She looked at him. You asked Mrs. Plum about my schedule. I did. What did she say? She said you hadn't taken a Sunday afternoon off in 4 months and she thought the fresh air would do you good. The corner of his mouth moved. She's warming up to the situation. Margaret let out a short breath that was not quite a laugh. It was close, though. Closer than she'd expected. All right, she said. Sunday. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He stood to go, and he was halfway to the door when the hotel's front bell rang, the sharp, insistent ring of someone arriving with urgency rather than patience, and Margaret heard Mrs. Plum's voice in the front hall, and then another voice, louder, with the specific carrying quality of a woman who had decided that volume was a form of authority. Eleanor Hawthorne. Caleb stopped at the kitchen door. Margaret did not move. They both listened. Eleanor's voice came through the wall with the clarity of someone who was not bothering to moderate it. I would like to know, she was saying to Mrs. Plum, exactly what is being permitted in the operational areas of this establishment, and whether you are aware of the reputational implications for a hotel of this standing. Mrs. Plum's reply was too low to make out. I don't care what the arrangement is, Eleanor continued. What I observed at last night's council meeting was a hotel employee inserting herself into official proceedings using information of dubious origin, and I think the people of this town are owed an explanation. Caleb's hand was on the kitchen door. Don't, Margaret said. He turned. Margaret, I mean it. Her voice quiet and absolutely level. This is not your fight to have for me. I'm not doing it for you, he said. I'm doing it because she's wrong, and she's doing it in a place where you work, and I'm done standing at a distance while she... Caleb. She said his name the way he sometimes said hers, like the complete sentence. If you walk out there right now and defend me to Eleanor Hawthorne, you will make everything harder. For the meeting. For the Northern Range ranchers. For everything that actually matters about what happened last night. He stopped. She could see him working through it, the specific struggle of a man who has both a temper and a conscience and is trying to let the conscience win. She cannot keep doing this, he said. I know, Margaret said. But the way to stop her isn't to fight her in the front hall of my workplace. Then what is it? Margaret thought about 7 pages of documentation. She thought about a room full of men who had held those pages and found their own voices because of them. She thought about what Eleanor Hawthorne had never once considered when she decided that Margaret Ellis was furniture. "Let me handle it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. Margaret untied her apron. She hung it on its hook. She smoothed the front of her dress, because she was Margaret Ellis, and she had decided a long time ago that she would always be presentable when it mattered, and this mattered. She walked through the kitchen door and into the front hall. Eleanor Hawthorne was standing near the reception desk with her coat and her authority, and the expression of a woman who had come to deliver a verdict. Mrs. Plum stood behind the desk with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to be caught in the crossfire. Eleanor saw Margaret. She drew herself up. "I was speaking with Mrs. Plum," she said. "I know," Margaret said. "I could hear you from the kitchen." A beat. "Then you heard what I said?" "Yes." Margaret stopped at a distance that was respectful but not retreating. "You said you want an explanation for what happened at the meeting last night." "I want to understand," Eleanor said, with the precision of someone choosing their words for effect, "how a kitchen employee came to be in possession of official council information, and how she came to present herself at a formal proceeding as though she had any authority to do so." "I'm happy to explain both things," Margaret said. "The information wasn't official council information. It was compiled from observations made over 4 years in this hotel's dining room, where council members, ranchers, and territorial officials have conducted their business in my presence because they did not consider me worth noticing." She held Eleanor's gaze without blinking. "You taught me that, Mrs. Hawthorne. Every time you reminded me of my place, you confirmed that people like you don't watch people like me. And people who aren't being watched see everything." The front hall of the Hollow Creek Hotel was very quiet. Mrs. Plum had gone entirely still behind the reception desk. Eleanor Hawthorne stood with her verdict, and her coat and her 51 years of social authority, and for the first time in Margaret's 9 years in Red Hollow, she had nothing immediate to say. "As for the authority question," Margaret continued, "I have none. I'm a kitchen worker. I presented numbers to a public meeting, because the numbers were accurate and the people who needed them didn't have them. If that's a problem, the problem is with the numbers, not with who brought them." She paused. "You're welcome to check them." Eleanor found her voice. "You are," she said, with a coldness that had replaced the precision, "a very presumptuous woman." "Yes," Margaret said, "I am." She turned. She walked back to the kitchen. She did not run. She closed the kitchen door behind her, and Caleb was standing exactly where she had left him, and he looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made the tension in his jaw release. "How did it go?" he said. Margaret picked up her apron. She tied it back on. "I told her the truth," she said. "That's all I know how to do." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Sunday, Margaret said. He left. She stood at the work table. In the front hall, she heard Eleanor Hawthorne's footsteps cross the floor and the main door open and close. Margaret put her hands flat on the work table surface and breathed. Something had shifted in her. Not since the kitchen door. Not since this morning, further back than that, starting from the moment 3 nights ago when she had sat down with a pen and 7 blank pages and decided that what she knew was worth saying out loud. She had spent 9 years making herself small enough to survive. She was starting to understand the cost of it, and she was starting to understand slowly, carefully, with the same precision she brought to everything, that the cost was one she had never actually agreed to pay. She had simply never believed she had a choice. The work table was solid under her hands. The stove was heating up behind her. Sunday was 4 days away. She had work to do between now and then, and she was going to do it well, the way she did everything. But underneath the ordinary motion of the day, something had taken root that wasn't going to wait for permission to grow. Sunday came the way important days always did, without ceremony, without any external indication that it was different from the Sundays before it. The sun rising over Red Hollow at the same angle and the same temperature as always. Indifferent to the fact that Margaret Ellis was standing in her small room at noon trying to decide what to wear. She owned 4 dresses that were not work dresses. Two of them were unsuitable, one too worn, one purchased 3 years ago when she had been narrower through the hips and no longer closed properly at the back. The third was a dark wool dress she had bought for her aunt's funeral and had never worn since, which seemed wrong for the occasion in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. The fourth was the one she had worn to the harvest dance, the faded blue cotton, simple and clean, the same dress she had been wearing when a coffee tray had nearly gone over the edge and two hands had come out of nowhere to steady it. She put on the blue dress. She braided her hair back the way she always wore it for work, then stopped, undid it, and did it again differently, looser, with less severity, the way she might wear it if she were not expecting to carry trays through a crowded room. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. She had never been comfortable with mirrors. Not because she was unaware of what she looked like, she was very aware, had been since childhood, but because mirrors had a way of showing you yourself through the accumulated eyes of everyone who had ever had an opinion about your appearance. And Margaret had been collecting other people's opinions since she was old enough to understand that her body was the kind of body that invited comment. She looked at herself now and tried to see only herself. Round face, dark eyes, the braid loose against her shoulder. A large woman in a faded blue dress, buttoned properly, wearing her Sunday afternoon expression, which was the same as her other expressions but with slightly less armor in it. "That'll have to do," she said out loud to no one. She put on her coat and went downstairs. Caleb was waiting at the hotel's front entrance. Not the service door, the front entrance. She registered that detail, precisely the deliberateness of it, the way it announced without words that this was not a kitchen visit, not a working morning conversation, not something that needed to happen out of view of the main street. He was standing at the front entrance in a clean coat with his hat in his hands, and when she came through the lobby and he saw her, something in his face arranged itself into an expression she had no previous entry for. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said, because she was not ready for whatever the end of that sentence was. He closed his mouth. Then he said, "All right." He offered his arm. Margaret looked at it for a moment. She thought about every window on the main street. Every pair of eyes that would track two people walking out of the Hollow Creek Hotel together on a Sunday afternoon, a large woman in a blue cotton dress on the arm of the wealthiest man in the territory. She thought about Eleanor Hawthorne. She thought about the walk to the front of the town hall. She took his arm. They walked. Nobody tried to stop them. The way the main street registered their passage with a low, particular attention, conversations pausing slightly as they went by. Heads turning with the precision of a population that had already been discussing this development and was now receiving new data. Margaret kept her chin level and her pace steady and her eyes on the road ahead, and Caleb walked beside her with the unhurried ease of a man who had decided something and was not looking for permission. "You're not nervous," she observed. "I'm a little nervous," he said. "I'm better at not showing it than you might expect." "What are you nervous about?" He glanced at her sideways. "My father," he said. "He's not difficult, exact. But he's direct. He'll say exactly what he thinks." "I want to warn you for that. I appreciate directness," Margaret said. "I find it restful." Something in his expression shifted with what might have been relief. "Good," he said. "That'll help." The Whitmore Ranch was 2 miles east of town, and they went by wagon rather than on foot. Caleb had left it at the livery, and he helped her up onto the seat with the matter-of-fact care of a man who had spent his life around physical work and understood the practical realities of getting a woman in a dress into a wagon seat without making it awkward. Margaret appreciated the matter-of-factness of it, the absence of the elaborate performance some men made of such gestures. The road opened up past the last of the town's buildings, and the sky over Montana did what Montana's skies did in October. It went enormous and blue and indifferent and magnificent all at once. The kind of sky that reminded you that human concerns, however pressing, occupied a very small portion of the available territory. Margaret breathed it in. "You don't get outside much," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "Kitchen work is inside work," she said. "Do you miss it being outside?" She thought about it honestly. "I used to walk in the evening," she said. "When I first came to Red Hollow." Before I learned that women walking alone in the evening drew the wrong kind of attention. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. That's wrong, he said. Yes, Margaret said, it is. They rode in silence for a moment. You should be able to walk in the evenings, he said. A lot of things should be different than they are, Margaret said. I've learned to work with what is. That's practical, he said. It's survival, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her. When did you stop believing they were the same thing, he said. The question landed somewhere important. Margaret thought about it. Recently, she said. He didn't ask more than that. He simply nodded the way he nodded when he'd received information he intended to keep. The ranch announced itself not through its buildings, but through the sound of its first cattle in the near distance, the low, continuous sound of an operation that was always working, always moving, never quite still. Margaret had heard ranches described in conversation hundreds of times across the hotel dining room table, but she had never been on one, and the scale of it as they came up the drive was different from anything she had imagined. Thomas Whitmore was sitting on the porch. He was in his early 70s, a big man gone lean with age, with Caleb's coloring and more of it darker, more weathered, the kind of face that had been put through decades of Montana seasons and had opinions about all of them. He was watching them come up the drive with an expression that gave nothing away yet. Caleb helped Margaret down from the wagon. They walked to the porch. Thomas Watch said, "This is Margaret Ellis." Thomas looked at her. His eyes were Caleb's eyes, direct, assessing the kind that didn't look away from what they were looking at. "Miss Ellis," he said. "Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said. "Sit down," Thomas said. He gestured to the chair beside him. "Both of you," they sat. For a moment, Thomas simply looked out toward the cattle in the near distance, not speaking. It was the silence of a man who had spent 70 years saying things when he had something to say, and not otherwise, and Margaret found it, exactly as she had told Caleb she would, restful. Then Thomas said, "My son tells me you're the one who put together the documentation that stalled the council vote Thursday." "I had information that was relevant," Margaret said. "I compiled it. Where'd you get it?" "The dining room of the Hollow Creek Hotel," she said. "Over 4 years of service work." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That's smart," he said. Not as a compliment, exactly, more as a plain assessment, the way you might describe a tool that had turned out to be more useful than its appearance suggested. "It's attention," Margaret said. "Anyone can pay attention." "No," Thomas said. "They can't. Most people hear what they're expecting to hear. You have to be trained out of that, or born without it." He glanced at her sideways. "Which are you trained?" Margaret said. "By 9 years of being expected to disappear." Thomas turned his head and looked at her directly. He said. Then he looked back at the cattle. Caleb beside Margaret had the specific stillness of a man trying very hard not to show that he was holding his breath. "Caleb tells me," Thomas said, in the same level, unhurried tone, "that you've been having morning conversations in the hotel kitchen. About business, ranch operations, the council situations." Thomas was quiet. "What other things?" he said. Margaret considered. "He told me about your wife," she said. "I told him about my aunt. We talked about what it means to make decisions alone, when you've been used to making them with someone." She paused. "We talked about what it's like to be surrounded by people and still be lonely." Thomas said nothing. The silence this time was different. It had something moving through it that hadn't been there before. "He's been lonely a long time," Thomas said. "Longer than he knows how to say." "I know," Margaret said. Thomas turned and looked at her again. This time the look lasted longer. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" Margaret said. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Honestly," he glanced at Caleb, "I expected someone who'd figured out that my son is a wealthy man and decided to figure out how to get close to him." Margaret nodded slowly. "That's a reasonable thing to expect," she said. "But that's not what you are. It isn't." "How do I know that?" Margaret looked at him. "You don't," she said. "Not yet." But I'd ask you to consider what I had to gain from walking to the front of a town hall meeting and presenting information that embarrassed the Hawthorne family in front of half of Red Hollow. Caleb wasn't in the room when I decided to do that. I didn't know he was there. I didn't do it to impress him. Thomas was quiet. Why did you do it, he said. Because the information was true and the people who needed it didn't have it, she said. And because I've spent 9 years being invisible, and I have things to say, and I am tired of saying them only to myself. Thomas Whitmore looked at Margaret Ellis for a long moment. Then something in his face shifted slowly, like something that had been braced against a weight for a long time and was deciding it might be all right to let the weight down. You Hungrit blinked. Ah, yes, she said. Actually, yes. Good, Thomas said, pushing himself up from the chair with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints had opinions. Come inside. Housekeeper made enough soup to feed a cattle drive. Caleb stood. He looked at Margaret with an expression so openly relieved that she almost laughed. She stood and followed Thomas Whitmore into the house. The afternoon went 4 hours. Margaret had not expected 4 hours. She had prepared herself for a careful, formal, probably uncomfortable hour, followed by an equally careful exit. What happened instead was Thomas Whitmore discovering over soup and bread and then coffee that Margaret had opinions about cattle breeding that he found professionally interesting, and that her interest was genuine rather than performed, and that once he had established those two things, he relaxed into conversation the way a man relaxes who has been sitting in a formal chair too long and has finally been given permission to stand. They talked about the ranch, about the specific challenges of the North Range operation, and the decisions that had to be made about winter pasturing. Margaret asked questions that came from 4 years of listening to men talk about exactly these problems in the hotel dining room. And Thomas answered them with the directness of a man who was not accustomed to explaining his thinking to someone who could actually follow it. Caleb sat between them and was mostly quiet, which was its own kind of eloquence, the silence of a man watching two people he cared about find each other across a table, not wanting to interrupt it. At one point, Thomas asked Margaret directly about her pastor parents, her aunt, how she had ended up in Red Hollow. She answered honestly, without decoration. She did not make her history smaller than it was, and she did not make it larger. She simply told it. When she was done, Thomas was quiet for a moment. Hard life, he said. Parts of it, Margaret said. Other parts were all right. What was all right? My aunt, she said. She taught me that work done well is its own kind of dignity. That you don't need someone else to confirm the value of what you do, as long as you know it yourself. She paused. I've been working on believing that fully. Thomas looked at her. She sounds like a woman worth knowing, he said. She was, Margaret said. She'd have liked you. Thomas made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him. Caleb, across the table, looked like a man whose whole chest had unclenched at once. The afternoon light was going thin when Caleb brought the wagon around, and Margaret said goodbye to Thomas on the porch. Thomas shook her hand, not the brief, perfunctory shake of a man being polite, the real kind, the kind that meant something. You'll come back, he said. It was not quite a question. If I'm Ed, Margaret said. You're invited, Thomas said. In the wagon on the road back to town, Margaret sat beside Caleb in the cooling evening and felt, for the first time since she had arrived in Red Hollow 9 years ago, that she was returning from somewhere rather than simply moving between obligations. He liked you, Caleb said. He's a practical man, Margaret said. He decided I was useful. That's how he shows he likes someone, Caleb said. By deciding they're worth his time, Margaret thought about that. He misses her, she said, your mother. Every day, Caleb said. It was the kind of marriage that becomes the structure of a person. When she died, part of the structure went with her. How long ago? He paused. The ranch kept running. But the house got quiet in a way I didn't know how to fix. Margaret looked at the road ahead. I know that kind of quiet, she said. I know you do, he said. The town appeared ahead of them, the first lights of Red Hollow, coming on against the early dark, the hotel's upper windows lit from within. The familiar's geometry of a place that had been her life for 9 years without ever quite feeling like it belonged to her. Caleb pulled up at the hotel's front entrance. He helped her down. He did not let go of her hand immediately. "Margaret," he said. She looked at him. "I need to say something," he said. "And I need you to actually hear it, not decide in advance what it means or what you're supposed to do with it." She waited. "I am not going to pretend," he said, "that this is a simple situation. I know it isn't. I know what the town thinks, and I know what Eleanor Hawthorne is going to keep doing, and I know the cost of all of it lands harder on you than it does on me." He paused. "But I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking you to let me keep being what we've been. And to let me, when the time comes to take the next step, take it beside you. Not in front of you, not behind you." She was very still. "What does beside mean?" she said carefully. "It means I don't do this without you," he said. "Any of it." Margaret looked at their joined hands. She thought about 9 years of standing at edges. She thought about the walk to the front of a room. She thought about Thomas Whitmore's handshake and the soup and 4 hours that felt like the beginning of something. She thought about what it meant to stop believing that survival and life were the same thing. "Okay," she said. "Okay," she said again, more firmly. Like a door she was choosing to open. Something in his face went very quiet and very certain both at once. He squeezed her hand once. He released it. She went inside. The days that followed were different from the days before them. Not outwardly, the hotel kitchen was the same, the coffee was the same, the trays moved along the same routes they had always moved. But underneath the ordinary surface of her work, something had settled that had not been settled before. A decision made, a direction chosen, and with it a specific kind of steadiness that she had not known she was missing until she felt it arrive. Caleb came every morning. He asked for her opinion on the winter pasturing decision. She gave it. He consulted her on a hiring question. One of his senior ranch hands was leaving, and the replacement candidates all had different strengths and different problems. And he laid out the situation and listened to her think through it aloud with the attentiveness of a man who had decided that her thinking was worth following. She had never in 9 years been in a situation where her thinking was treated as something worth following. It was changing her in ways she could feel but not yet fully name. 2 weeks after Sunday at the ranch, the winter pasture question became urgent in the way ranching questions became urgent quickly, driven by weather, with no patience for gradual decision-making. A cold front came down from the north earlier than expected, and Caleb arrived at the kitchen door not at his usual time but at 6 in the morning, while Margaret was still on her first coffee. With his coat on and his expression carrying the particular tight focus of a man who had been awake for most of the night. "I need your read on something," he said. She poured him coffee without preamble. He laid out the situation, 2 pasture options for winter rotation, one safer and one that required a gamble on the weather holding through late November. His foreman wanted the safe option. Caleb's own instinct pushed toward the gamble, but he couldn't fully articulate why, and the uncertainty was costing him sleep. Margaret listened. She thought about the conversations she had absorbed across the hotel dining room table. She thought about what she knew about the weather patterns in the northern range, from 3 years of serving breakfast to men who talked about nothing else between November and March. "The Campbell family," she said. "They run the spread 20 miles north of your north boundary." "I know them," Caleb said. "Mr. Campbell had lunch here every Wednesday for 2 years," Margaret said. "He tracked the late November weather on that range closer than anyone I ever heard. He said 3 times, I remember specifically because he said it the same way each time, that the worst years were the ones that came in gentle. That when November came in hard and fast, it usually broke by the 25th. But when it crept in quiet, it settled." Caleb was very still. "This front came in fast," he said. "It came in hard and cold in a single night," Margaret said. Not creeping, he looked at her. "The gamble," he said. "That's what Mr. Campbell would say," Margaret said. "I'm a hotel kitchen worker with 4 years of absorbed weather conversation. You make the call." "I'm making the call," Caleb said. I'm making it based on your information. Then it's your call. It's our call, he said. She looked at him. That's a dangerous word, she said. I know, he said. I mean it. He left to get the winter rotation started. Margaret stood at the work table and thought about the word hour, how small it was, how much weight it carried, how different the world looked from inside it versus outside it. She had been outside it for 26 years. She was not entirely sure how to live inside it yet. But she was learning. The weather broke by the 24th. Caleb's gamble held. His foreman, a weathered man named Pete who had spent 30 years suspicious of anything he hadn't personally verified, came to the hotel kitchen 3 days later not to see Caleb, but specifically to see Margaret. He came through the front door, which was wrong, and asked Mrs. Plum to send for her, which was alarming enough that Clara came to the kitchen with wide eyes to report it. Margaret went to the front. Pete was standing near the reception desk with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and was not sure he was going to execute it well. Miss Ellis, he said. Mr. Pete, she said carefully. I wanted to come and say he started, then stopped. Caleb told me the information about the weather pattern came from you. He paused. I was against the gamble. I want you to know I was wrong, and I want to say that directly, because if I had my way, we'd have been in the wrong pasture when that front broke. Margaret looked at him. I appreciate you coming to say that, she said. That was decent of you. Caleb says you know things about this territory that most people don't, Pete said. I believe him now. He turned his hat once. If you ever have something to say about ranch operations, I'm willing to listen. He left. Margaret stood in the front hall of the hotel with Mrs. Plum watching from behind the desk with an expression that was working hard to remain neutral. That was Pete Hanlon, Mrs. Plum said. He's been foreman at the Whitmore Ranch for 20 years. I know, Margaret said. He came to apologize to you, Mrs. Plum said. He came to correct his record, Margaret said. That's different. And better. Mrs. Plum was quiet for a moment. Then she said the rates at this hotel are going up in the new year. I'm going to need someone who can manage the supply accounts. Someone with attention for numbers. Margaret looked at her. I'm a kitchen worker, she said. You're wasted in the kitchen, Mrs. Plum said, with the brisk directness of a woman who has decided something and is not interested in an extended discussion about it. Think about it. She went back to the business of the desk. Margaret went back to the kitchen. She stood at the work table. She thought about her aunt's voice saying, work done well is its own kind of dignity. She thought about what it meant when the world started to rearrange itself around a person who had decided to stop agreeing to be invisible. She thought about it for a long time. Then Clara came in with the lunch preparations and Margaret started working, and the afternoon moved forward the way afternoons did with or without her permission. She was closing up the kitchen that evening when she heard the hotel's front bell, and then voices in the lobby that she could not immediately identify a man's voice, older, with an authority in it that was different from the authority of money or social position, the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to in an official capacity. She found out the next morning what it had been. Caleb was at the kitchen door earlier than usual, and his expression was the kind she had come to associate with situations that were going to require careful thinking. The council, he said before she could ask. Oakes has found a workaround. Margaret went still. What workaround? He's arguing that the documentation presented at the Thursday meeting, your documentation was inadmissible, because it was presented by a private individual without official standing, and that the vote to table was therefore procedurally invalid. Caleb sat down. He's pushing to reschedule the vote with the original proposal reinstated. Margaret absorbed this. On what grounds does he claim the vote was invalid, she said. He's arguing that public comment must be submitted in writing in advance and cannot be presented in the form of unsolicited testimony during formal proceedings. That's not what the Territorial Council rules say, Margaret said. Caleb looked at her. You know the Territorial Council rules. The chairman of the Territorial Appeals Board had lunch here every third Tuesday for a year and a half, Margaret said. He complained about procedural violations the entire time. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. "Tell me what the rules actually say," he said. She told him. He listened with his coffee going cold in front of him and his whole attention on what she was saying, and when she was done, he sat back and looked at her with the expression she now recognized as the one that meant a decision had been made. "I need you to write it down," he said. "I can do that," she said. "And I need you to come with me to Billings," he said. Margaret blinked. "Billings? I have an attorney there. His name is Gerald Marsh. He's been trying to find grounds to challenge the Hawthorne influence on the council for 2 years. What you just told me is the grounds. You want me to go to Billings to speak with your attorney. I want you to go to Billings because you have information my attorney doesn't have and can't get any other way, and because this fight is not just about the ranch." He held her gaze. "Hicks is going to lose his spread if this goes through. So will 4 other families on the North Range. You have the information that stops it." Margaret thought about Hicks standing up in the town hall meeting. She thought about the specific, careful anger of a man watching years of work, threatened by people with better resources than him. "When," she said. "Thursday," Caleb said. "We'd go by train. Back by Saturday. Away from Red Hollow. Away from the kitchen and the hotel and Mrs. Plum's careful neutrality and Eleanor Hawthorne's social architecture. 2 days in which the world would notice and the world would have opinions." Margaret thought about all the reasons to say no. She had gotten very good over 26 years at generating reasons to say no. It was a skill she had honed to efficiency: the rapid inventory of risk, the assessment of cost, the calculation of what could be lost. She could do it in seconds. She did it now. Then she thought about Thomas Whitmore's handshake. She thought about Pete Hanlon coming through the front door with his hat in his hands. She thought about Mrs. Plum saying "you're wasted" in the kitchen with the brisk matter-of-factness of a woman who had decided to say something true. She thought about Hicks. She thought about the word "our." "Thursday," she said. "Yes." Caleb let out a breath. "I'll arrange the tickets," he said. "I'll write up the documentation tonight," she said. "Everything I know about the procedural rules, and everything I know about the actual numbers." She paused. "It'll be more than 7 pages this time." "Good," he said. He stood. He picked up his hat. He stopped at the kitchen door and looked at her with the expression she had no previous entry for, and was slowly, carefully, building a new one. "Margaret," he said. "Caleb," she said. "Whatever happens in Billings," he said. "Whatever happens with the council and Oaks and Eleanor Hawthorne and all of it, I want you to know something." She waited. "I'm not asking you to do this for the ranch," he said. "Or for Hicks. Or for any of it." "Then what are you asking me for?" she said. He held her gaze. "I'm asking because you deserve to be in the room where it matters," he said. "And I intend to make sure you are." The kitchen held them both. Then Margaret said, "You should know that I intend to be in the room whether you arrange it or not." A beat. He laughed, the real laugh, the one that happened before the decision to let it out. "I know," he said. "That's why I asked." He left. Margaret stood at the work table with the morning light coming through the kitchen window and the smell of coffee and bread in the air, and something building inside her, that she was finally, after 26 years, ready to call by its right name. Not survival. Not endurance. Not the careful, measured management of a life kept deliberately small. Something larger. Something that had been there all along, waiting for the room to grow into. She picked up her pen. She started writing. The train to Billings left Red Hollow at 7 in the morning. Margaret had been awake since 4. Not from nerves, or not only from nerves, but from the particular alertness that comes when a person knows they are standing at the edge of something that cannot be undone once crossed. She had finished the documentation the night before, 14 pages this time, organized with the same precision she brought to everything. Moving from the procedural rules she had absorbed from 2 years of the appeals board chairman's Tuesday lunches to the specific numbers that proved what the council's proposal was actually designed to accomplish and who it was designed to benefit. 14 pages. She had read them twice through before she folded them. They were good. She knew they were good, not because she needed someone else to confirm it, but because she understood what good work looked like, and this was it. Her aunt's voice in her head, steady as it had always been, worked well as its own kind of dignity. She put the pages in her traveling case, alongside the 2 other dresses she owned that were appropriate for the kind of meeting they were going to. She went downstairs. Caleb was at the front entrance again. He looked at her traveling case, and then at her face, and then he said, "Ready?" "Yes," she said. They walked to the station. The train platform held a handful of early travelers, a merchant couple from the south end of town, 2 young ranch hands going to Billings for reasons that were probably their own business. An older woman Margaret didn't recognize, who looked at her and Caleb with the alert curiosity of someone who intended to have a story to tell by nightfall. Margaret stood beside Caleb on the platform and did not look at the woman. "She's going to talk," Caleb said quietly, not looking at the woman either. "She was going to talk anyway," Margaret said. "The only question was what about." "And now she has material." "Now she has material," Margaret agreed. Something in his expression moved. "You're not bothered," he said. "I'm a little bothered," she said. "But I've decided to be bothered quietly." He looked at her with that particular expression, the one she had stopped, pretending she didn't have a name for. The train arrived. They boarded. The ride to Billings was 4 hours through the kind of landscape produced that meant effort, open and vast and operating entirely on its own scale, indifferent to human schedules and concerns. Margaret sat by the window and watched it move past and felt the specific physical sensation of distance from Red Hollow increasing with every mile, which was not entirely uncomfortable. Caleb sat across from her. They talked, not about the documentation or the attorney or the counsel. They talked the way they talked in the kitchen on the good mornings, about things that mattered in the longer sense, the way 2 people talk when they have stopped performing conversation and started actually having it. He told her about the first winter he'd run the ranch alone, after his father stepped back. The mistakes he'd made, and the ones he'd caught before they became disasters, and the one that had cost him 3 months of revenue and a relationship with a supplier that had taken 2 years to rebuild. "What did you learn from it?" Margaret asked. "That being right about the goal doesn't mean you're right about the method," he said. "And that the people who've been watching longer than you have usually know something you don't." Margaret thought about that. "Pete," she said. "Pete was the one who told me about the supplier problem before it became a disaster," Caleb said. "I didn't listen. I was 28, and I thought listening was the same as admitting I didn't know what I was doing." He paused. "I know better now, Wudge," he said. "And a few expensive lessons." He looked at her. "And recently, watching someone who's been invisible for 9 years walk to the front of a room and change the outcome of an official vote with information she'd compiled by herself, alone, with no support and no guarantee that anyone would listen." Margaret looked at her hands in her lap. "That's a generous description," she said. "It's an accurate one." "It was terrifying," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what made it something worth watching." Billings was larger than Red Hollow by a factor that reminded Margaret how small Red Hollow actually was, streets that went on past where you could see the end of them. Buildings stacked beside each other with the compressed logic of a place that had grown faster than it had planned for, the general noise and movement of a city that had not decided to be finished yet. Gerald Marsh's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on the main commercial street. He was a man of 50 with the tightly organized appearance of someone who had spent a career managing other people's crises and had developed a professional calm that could probably withstand significant disruption. He stood when they came in. He looked at Caleb and then at Margaret and then back at Caleb with a question in his expression that Caleb answered by pulling out a chair for Margaret and sitting down beside her rather than across from her. Marsh recalibrated visibly and sat down. "Mr. Whitmore told me you have documentation," Marsh said, addressing Margaret directly, which she appreciated. "I do," she said. She laid the 14 pages on his desk. He picked them up. He read. The office was quiet while he read. A clock on the wall kept the time with the deliberate patience of a clock that had sat through many important silences. Outside on the street, Billings went about its business without caring about any of theirs. Marsh turned a page, then another. Then he put the pages down and looked at Margaret over them with an expression that had moved from professional assessment into something more genuine. "Where did you get the procedural information?" he said. She told him about the appeals board chairman and the Tuesday lunches. "Harrington?" Marsh said. "Walter Harrington was your source?" "I served him lunch for a year and a half," Margaret said. "He was a thorough complainer, very precise about what the rules said versus what counsels actually did." Marsh stared at her. "Walter Harrington is the most respected procedural authority in the territory," he said. "He also prefers his coffee with 2 sugars," Margaret said. "And he thinks the biscuits at the Hollow Creek Hotel are the best in Montana." Marsh looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing, with the practiced quiet of a man who was enjoying himself. Marsh looked back at Margaret. "This documentation," he said, picking up the pages again, "is better organized than most of what my own staff produces. And the procedural argument on pages 8 through 11 is not only correct, it's the argument I've been trying to construct for 2 years without the specific precedent you've cited on page 10. "The Dennison case," Margaret said. 1878. Harrington mentioned it 3 times over the course of different lunches. I connected it to the current situation because the structure was similar." "The Dennison case," Marsh repeated, almost to himself. Then he straightened the pages and set them down with the decisive movement of a man who had made a decision. "Miss Ellis," he said, "I would like to formally engage your assistance on this matter." Margaret looked at him. "I work in a hotel kitchen," she said. "Not as a lawyer," Marsh said. "As a research consultant. What you have here represents a quality of territorial knowledge that I cannot obtain through standard channels." He paused. "I would pay you for your time." The clock kept its patient count. Caleb beside her was looking at the wall with the studied neutrality of a man, making a significant effort not to influence the moment. Margaret thought about Mrs. Plum saying, "You're wasted in the kitchen." She thought about Pete Hanlon coming through the front door with his hat in his hands. She thought about 14 pages written by lamplight and the satisfaction of knowing they were good. "We can discuss the specifics later," she said. "First, tell me what you need for the council challenge." Marsh told her. They worked for 3 hours. Margaret answered questions, clarified citations, walked him through the sequence of the numerical argument and where it connected to the procedural one. Marsh's clerk, a young man of about 20 who had started the meeting with the bored expression of someone who expected it to be routine, was taking notes with increasing urgency by the end of the first hour. And by the end of the third, he had filled a notebook and started on a second. When they were done, Marsh sat back and looked at the material spread across his desk. "This is enough," he said, "more than enough. The procedural challenge alone would have been sufficient, but combined with the numerical documentation and the Dennison precedent," he paused. "The council's reinstatement push will fail, and I can make a case that Oakes's workaround itself constitutes an improper procedural maneuver, which opens the door to a formal review of his conduct." "How long will it take?" Caleb asked. "Filing by end of next week. Hearing within 30 days, given the time-sensitive nature of the grazing leases." Marsh looked at Margaret. "I'll need you available for questions between now and the hearing." "I'm in Red Hollow," Margaret said. "I know where you are," Marsh said. "I'll work around it." They left the office at 4:30. On the street outside, the late afternoon light was doing something generous to the city. Margaret stood on the sidewalk with her traveling case and the specific sensation of a person who has just done something that cannot be undone. "Well, Caleb," she said. "Research consultant," he said. "Don't make more of it than it is," she said. "It's a great deal," he said. "It's a conversation that might lead somewhere," she said. "That's all." He looked at her with the expression. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Deciding in advance how much you're allowed to have." She was quiet. The city moved around them, people on their own errands, going their own directions. Not paying the slightest attention to a large woman in a blue dress and a rancher with his hat in his hands standing on a Billings sidewalk at the edge of something important. "Old habit," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I'm asking you to consider a new one." She looked at him. She thought about the 14 pages. She thought about Marsh's face when he read them, the genuine shift from professional to something more honest. She thought about what it meant when the world started to organize itself around what you actually were, rather than what it had decided you were allowed to be. "All right," she said. He smiled. The real one, not the slight movement of the corner of his mouth, but the full version. The one she had seen rarely enough that she had committed each instance to memory without intending to. "Are you hungry?" he said. "Extremely," she said. They had dinner at a restaurant on the main street where no one knew their names or their history or what anyone in Red Hollow thought about the specific combination of who they were. They ate and talked, and the evening went easy and warm around them. And Margaret felt, sitting across the table from Caleb Whitmore in a city where she was nobody in particular, that this was what it felt like to simply exist in a moment without the accumulated weight of other people's opinions pressing down on it. She wanted to remember the exact quality of it. She thought she probably would. They took separate rooms at the hotel. In the morning, over breakfast, Caleb asked her something she hadn't expected. "When this is settled," he said. "The council situation, the challenge, all of it, what do you want?" She looked up. "What do I want?" she repeated. "Not what you'll accept," he said. "Not what seems reasonable given the circumstances. What you actually want." She thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. "I want to do work that matters," she said. "I want to use what I know in a way that's not hidden. Not invisible." She paused. "I've been invisible for so long that I stopped knowing what it would feel like to be otherwise. I'm starting to find out." He listened. "I want to stop spending my energy making myself small," she said. "I've been doing it so long I've gotten efficient at it, and efficiency at the wrong thing is still the wrong thing." He nodded, and personally, he said, "Carefully. What do you want personally?" She looked at him across the breakfast table. She thought about all the reasons to answer carefully. Then she thought about what she'd told herself on the train ride out, that she was done generating reasons to say no. "I want what's been building in that kitchen every morning. For the last 2 months," she said. "I want it to keep building. I want to find out what it becomes." Caleb was very still. "That's what I want too," he said. "I know," she said. "You know, Caleb," she said, with the quiet patience of a woman who has been paying attention for 9 years. "I know." He laughed. She smiled. They took the train home. The council challenge was filed the following Thursday. Marsh was as good as his word, precise, fast, and devastating in the specific way that good legal work is devastating, which is quietly and with documentation. Oakes's reinstatement push collapsed within 2 weeks under the weight of the procedural argument and the Denison precedent and the full numerical analysis that showed, in terms no one could argue, that the original proposal had been built on data that did not reflect the actual state of the territory. There was a formal review of Oakes's conduct. Arthur Hawthorne stepped back from the council before the review concluded, which was its own kind of answer about what the review was going to find. Hicks kept his spread. So did the 4 other families on the North Range. The new lease rate structure, when it was finalized 6 weeks later, was based on accurate data and applied evenly. 3 of the small ranchers sent notes to Marsh's office. Marsh forwarded them to Margaret. She kept them in the inside pocket of her coat for a while, the way you keep things that are too important to put away in a drawer. Red Hollow did not transform overnight. That was not how towns worked, and Margaret had never expected it to. People with long memories and firm opinions did not rearrange themselves around a new fact just because the fact was true. Eleanor Hawthorne did not apologize. She did not appear to be considering it. She continued to move through Red Hollow with the settled authority of a woman who had decided that the recent events were a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent shift. But things changed anyway, the way things change when they have decided to change regardless of individual opinions. Mrs. Plum gave Margaret the supply accounts in December, along with a pay adjustment that Margaret negotiated herself with the same flat factual precision she brought to everything. It took 15 minutes, and Mrs. Plum accepted her terms with the expression of a woman who was relieved to be dealing with someone who knew what they wanted. Marsh sent cases periodically questions that required the specific kind of territorial knowledge that no document could provide and no standard research could locate. Margaret answered them at the kitchen table in the evenings, or at the hotel's small office desk when Mrs. Plum gave her use of it, and the work was precise and satisfying in a way that had its own particular warmth to it. Caleb came every morning, and then in February he did not come to the kitchen. He came to the front entrance, as he had on the Sunday of the ranch visit, and he asked Mrs. Plum for Margaret, and Mrs. Plum came to find her in the office with an expression that was specifically designed to be neutral and was not quite succeeding. Margaret went to the front. Caleb was standing near the reception desk with his hat in his hands and his good coat on, and an expression she had never seen on him before, something underneath the steadiness. Something that was not quite nervousness, but was in the same neighborhood. "Can we walk?" he said. They walked. Main Street, mid-morning February, light, thin and cold, and doing its best. Red Hollow watched them go by with the practiced attention of a population that had been following this particular development for months and had strong opinions about where it was heading. At the end of the main street, where the town gave way to the open road east, Caleb stopped. He turned to face her. He was still holding his hat. "I have something to say," he said, "and I've been thinking about how to say it for about 3 weeks, and I've decided that thinking about it isn't making it easier, so I'm just going to say it." Margaret waited. "You know what everyone in Red Hollow sees when they look at me," he said. "You told me once. My money, my name." "I remember," she said. "And you know what I saw when I looked at you," he said. "From the very first night." She was very still. "You were the only person in that room who didn't want anything from me," he said. "And that's true. But it's not the whole truth." He paused. "The whole truth is that you were the only person in that room who was entirely yourself. Not who the room wanted you to be. Not who Eleanor Hawthorne had decided you should be. Just entirely, exactly yourself." He looked at her. "I have never in my life met someone as fully themselves as you are. And I have spent the last 4 months watching you walk to the front of rooms that weren't ready for you, write 14 pages by a kitchen lamp, because the work was worth doing. Sit across a table from my father and tell him the truth about yourself, without apology." He stopped. "I have spent 4 months being more certain about you than I have been about anything, since I was 22 years old, and I knew this ranch was my life's work." The February air was cold and direct, and carrying the specific smell of Montana winter, clean and sharp and indifferent to the fact that 2 people were standing at the end of the main street of Red Hollow in the middle of a Tuesday morning having the most important conversation of both their lives. "Margaret Ellis," Caleb said, "I am asking you to marry me." He said it plainly. No speech, no performance. In the voice of a man who meant what he said, and had decided that elaborate framing was a way of distancing yourself from the weight of the thing. Margaret looked at him. She thought about the coffee tray. She thought about the kitchen doorway and his hat in his hands. She thought about 2 cups on the work table and the easy silence of mornings that felt like home. She thought about Thomas Whitmore's handshake. She thought about the train to Billings and the dinner where no one knew their names. She thought about 9 years of making herself small and the specific work of undoing it, and how she was not done undoing it. And how she suspected that the undoing was something that would take the rest of her life. And then she thought about whether she wanted to do that work alone or beside someone who had never once, from the very first moment, asked her to be smaller than she was. She thought about the word "are." "Yes," she said, 1 word. But she said it with her whole voice, not the careful portion of it she had been rationing out to the world for 26 years, the full thing, without apology, without qualification, without the preemptive management of expectation that had become her survival language. Just yes. Caleb let out a breath. He put his hat on. He reached out and took her hand. They stood at the end of the main street of Red Hollow, Montana, in February 1 Einsad, 886, and did not say anything else for a while, because there was nothing else that needed saying just then. And both of them were people who understood the value of not adding words to a moment that was already complete. They were married in April, At the ranch, in a ceremony that was small by the standards of Whitmore family history, but enormous by the standards of what Margaret Ellis had ever imagined for herself. Thomas Whitmore stood up beside his son, Clara stood up beside Margaret and cried through the entire ceremony, which she did not apologize for, and which Margaret found, in spite of everything, completely endearing. Pete Hanlon was there. Marsh came from Billings. Hicks came from the North Range with his wife and two of his neighbors, and shook Margaret's hand at the reception with both of his, and did not let go immediately, which she understood. Eleanor Hawthorne was not there. She had sent a formal card of congratulation that read, in its entirety, "Warmest wishes to the Whitmore family on the occasion of this union." Margaret read it once and put it in a drawer, and did not take it out again, which was its own kind of grace, the grace of not needing to win, because winning had never been the point. The years that came after were full. Not easy, nothing was easy in the territory, and the ranch was a living thing that demanded constant attention and had no patience for sentiment. But full, in the way that a life is full when it is being used for what it was built for, when the work matches the person and the person has finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. Margaret managed the Whitmore Ranch from the second year of their marriage, a role she moved into, with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to everything else, and with results that Pete Hanlon began citing in conversations with neighboring operations as the standard he was trying to match. She continued her consulting work with Marsh's office, which grew as her reputation for territorial knowledge spread through the legal community in ways she had not anticipated and did not discourage. She wrote letters. She had always been good at letters, had written them for other hotel workers who needed them, had composed careful notes on behalf of people who did not have the words, and now she wrote them for the small ranchers on the North Range when disputes arose, and for the women in town who needed documents prepared and had no one who knew how to do it, and sometimes simply for herself, in a journal she kept in the drawer of the desk Caleb built for her in the corner of the ranch's main office. In the 4th year of their marriage, a young woman arrived at the Red Hollow train station with a small suitcase and the specific expression that Margaret recognized from the inside, the expression of someone who has traveled a long way from something they were running from and has not yet located what they were running toward. Margaret saw her from across the platform. She walked over. "Can I help you?" she said. The young woman looked at her, taking in, Margaret knew, the full measure of her. The size of her, the plainness of her dress, the confidence of her posture, which was something that had come slowly over years, and was now simply the way she stood. "I'm looking for work," the young woman said. "I was told there might be something at the hotel." "The hotel has a kitchen position open," Margaret said. "I know the manager. I can introduce you." The young woman looked at her with the cautious assessment of someone who has learned not to accept help from strangers without first establishing why the help is being offered. "Why would you do that?" she said. Margaret looked at her. She thought about a large woman in a faded apron at the edge of a dance floor, learning to be invisible so she could survive. She thought about what it had cost. She thought about what it had taken to undo it. "Because someone should have done it for me," she said. "And because this town is harder than it looks, and it's easier with someone who knows the inside of it." The young woman was quiet for a moment. "Was it hard for you?" she said. "When you came?" "Yes," Margaret said. "How did you manage?" Margaret thought about it honestly. She tried to think about everything. "I paid attention," she said. "I kept doing the work. And eventually I stopped believing that surviving was the same thing as living." She looked at the young woman steadily. That last part was the hardest, but it was also the part that changed everything. The young woman considered this. Then she picked up her suitcase. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They walked into Red Hollow together. Thomas Whitmore, in the years that followed, liked to say that the best decision Caleb had ever made was walking into a side hallway to say something he should have said sooner. Caleb's version was that the best decision he'd ever made was going back to the kitchen the next morning. Margaret, when she was asked, and she was asked, More and more as the years passed and her presence in the territory became something people pointed to as the kind of story worth telling, said that the best decision she had ever made was the night she sat down with a pen and 7 blank pages and decided that what she knew was worth saying out loud. They were all correct. They were also all describing the same decision, which was the decision that every person who had been told they did not belong eventually faced, the decision to stop agreeing. Margaret Whitmore of Red Hollow, Montana, made that decision in October of 1885, at 26 years old, while standing at a kitchen work table with her hands flat on the surface and a town that had decided she was invisible all around her. She spent the rest of her life proving the town wrong. Not through anger, not through performance, through the quiet daily, relentless application of everything she was in a world that had wanted her small and found, to its eventual amazement, that she had never actually agreed to be. The person everyone had overlooked had always been exactly and entirely herself, and that had always been more than enough.